Hello and welcome. I'm James Burnett, the Trace's Managing Director, and I'm so grateful to y'all for joining us. Your participation in these virtual events is essential to their impact, and we're just really thankful to you for making time to tune in. Our gratitude goes out as well to the funders and members whose thoughtful generosity makes our independent journalism possible. We're here today to talk about the Trace's investigative reporting on the gun industry. You're going to hear from members of our nonprofit newsroom who are doing that vital and often difficult work, how they go about it, why we as an organization think it is so important. I also hope that by the end, you'll leave with a new way of looking at the larger issue of gun violence. For many people, firearms are potent symbols. They're also, though, a product designed, produced, marketed, sold by an industry in search of profits. By dedicating in-depth, ongoing coverage to the gun business as a business, the Trace is bringing unprecedented transparency and accountability to a group of companies and trade groups with profound effects on American life. Before we begin, please take a moment and find the Q&A button down there at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question for our speakers, pop it in there. And at the end of today's event, we will get to as many of those queries as we can. Now let's get underway. Your moderator is Tally Woodward, the Trace's editor-in-chief, who leads all of our dogged coverage of gun violence. She's also personally shepherded many of the breakthrough stories that inspired this event. She's joined on the panel by staff writer Champ Barton, whose reporting has shed fresh light on gun manufacturing and product safety in investigations published in partnership with the Washington Post and Business Week. Our second panelist is Ava Sassani. She's an assistant editor with the Trace's Gun Violence Data Hub, where you'll find extensive data and geo mapping of federally licensed dealers, monthly estimates of gun sales, lots of important information on the industry. Recently, Ava herself calculated the windfall that the gun industry has received in federal contracts during the Trump administration's immigration raids. Finally, rounding out our speakers is senior writer Mike Spees. You may know him from his groundbreaking reporting on self-dealing and corruption at the NRA. Last year, he spent much of 2025 bringing scrutiny to the gun industry's lower profile, but really arguably more powerful trade group, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, in a series of articles that were just really chock full of eye-opening findings, some of which you'll hear more about today. One more time, a reminder to please share those questions in the Q&A box. Tally, Champ, Ava, Mike, the floor is yours.
Thanks, James. Hello, everyone, and glad to have you here. So about 5 or 6 years ago, we had at the Trace an editorial meeting where we posed the question to ourselves, what is the truly uncovered territory when it comes to guns in America, which is obviously our beat. And one of the clear and unanimous answers we reached was, how does the firearms industry work? How does it make and market its products? What does it really know about who buys firearms and who uses them? And this kind of series of questions that have been evolving and getting more specific over these years have led to dozens of Trace stories on everything from Glock switches to the resale of police guns, internet marketing, gun shops, the surge in gun sales during the pandemic, all kinds of things. But in the past year, the Trace has published its best and most groundbreaking work on the gun industry, in my opinion, which is obviously a little biased. But it's been thanks to the reporters who are here with us today, these three reporters. So just to kind of get us started, I want to ask each of them to say why the area of the gun industry interests them still and why they think it's important. I want to start with Champ, who became curious about the industry really soon after arriving at the Trace as a fellow many years ago. And would just love to hear from you, Champ, about why you think it's important to look at the industry specifically.
Yeah, sure. I mean, our mission at the Trace is to, do reporting that helps elucidate this, problem about gun violence in the United States. And it always struck me that, you know, thousands of people are killed every year in homicides and suicides. And we spend a lot of time reporting on regulation. We spend a lot of time reporting on politics. We spend a lot of time reporting on lobbying. But at the time, at least when I arrived at the Trace and around the time that we had this moonshot meeting, it didn't seem like sort of anyone in the journalism world was dedicating a lot of attention to the products that fuel this crisis. And it sort of was most clear to me in the formula of the fact that all of these, every one of these shootings, just about, with the exception of shootings by, homemade firearms, which at the time weren't even that, popular, um, is committed with a gun that was manufactured in most cases lawfully by a corporation in the United States or elsewhere, and then sold into the stream of commerce. And it's only after that point that it gets diverted into some sort of criminal use. And so it felt vital to me to focus upstream and to try to look into the industry that was making those products.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense, and is helpful to hear from you, even for me, even though I work with you every day. Ava, could you, you're newest to this beat broadly, and you've been digging into the industry really from the data side since you arrived at the Trace. Can you say a little bit about, what makes you intrigued by it and want to figure things out?
Yeah, absolutely. The gun industry and the role of the gun lobby in general is part of why I wanted to become an investigative journalist in the first place. I was in college when the Parkland shooting happened, and I unfortunately had a very close family friend who was at that high school when the shooting happened. And they survived and they were okay. But in the aftermath, I was able to see sort of up close what the full might of the gun industry is in the work to get legislation passed after that shooting, both in Florida and nationally. And I was obviously aware of the power of the gun industry and the gun lobby before then, but I think witnessing that really it made me understand more closely how the gun industry, I think, has very successfully convinced a lot of Americans and a lot of people in power that their interests are the same as the country's interests. And what drew me to journalism, what drew me to the Trace, and covering this part of our beat specifically, is sort of trying to understand when the American people want something that politicians are hesitant to deliver on, why does that disconnect happen? Very often it's because of industry ties, money, lobbying, and all of that stuff. So, sort of broadly, why I'm in this profession in the first place.
Yeah, that makes sense. Mike, you've been on this broad beat for a decade, longer than any of the rest of us here. Why is it important for the public to know specifically about the makers and sellers of firearms and sort of what they're up to?
Well, I think, for the first half of the decade that I was at the Trace, I was really focused on, or exclusively focused on, the lobby and how that, and in part because we had been in the midst of what became like a mass shooting epidemic, and there was this ongoing question about why we can't have any reform, and that was what most people were interested in. And the most obvious place to look when we first started was the National Rifle Association, because that is the organization that represents specifically the most gun owners, and it's also the most recognizable, and it had the loudest voice. And in some ways, that overshadowed what was happening on the other side, which was the industry and the companies that are responsible for making the products that ultimately allow for mass shootings and other forms, many other forms of gun violence to happen. Um, so I felt like we had accomplished a lot on educating the public on what the lobby does and how it works, and we hadn't really pierced the veil of the gun industry yet. And my thinking was, or in general, I think it's sort of essential to look at any kind of industry where there's an inherent tension between profits and public health and also in this case political stability. And at what point public health and uh, political stability were knowingly being sacrificed to fuel profit. And as the second Trump administration came into power, and as our country's democracy seemed to be generally uh, on a shaky foundation, it seemed more important to understand what was happening with respect to the industry. For me, because I had spent so much time with the NRA, the obvious place for me to go was the trade group that represents the gun industry, which is the National Shooting Sports Foundation, in part because I wanted to understand how the industry thought about its customers privately. And the NSSF is sort of like functioned as like a central clearinghouse for intelligence, information sharing, and that sort of thing. So it seemed like a very obvious place to start. And that's what I did.
So you touched on the profit motive. I think it's easy because, I mean, as James was saying earlier, because guns are such potent symbols in America, to sort of for that to obscure the fact that this is a business and that they're really focused on selling their wares and making money. But the gun industry is also kind of unlike other businesses in some key ways that are related to but a little distinct from um, from the politics aspect of it. Champ, can you sort of explain how the big thing that makes the gun industry really different from
Yeah,
most, makers of consumer products?
sure. The industry broadly has a kind of legal immunity that other industries just do not enjoy. And it cuts across a few different dimensions of the industry's business. On the one hand, there is the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, which is focused specifically on protecting gun makers from the kind of litigation that forced reform in other industries like the pharmaceutical industry, the automotive industry, the tobacco industry, where victims would allege that sort of business practices, negligent business practices, had contributed to some sort of public health crisis. This wasn't the same as saying that the products were defective. It has to do with sort of distribution of the products, marketing of the products, and whether that distribution and marketing is taking into account the public safety and public health. There is also another dimension of immunity, kind of, which I've sort of been really focused on over the past few years, which is that in almost every other product that is sold to consumers in the United States, there are regulatory bodies that oversee product safety and spend a lot of time and energy to try to both suss out whether allegations of product defects have merit, to issue recalls when recalls are warranted, and to police the industry in situations where the industry is acting negligently for their own benefit, but to the harm of the public. And when Congress set up the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which oversees the vast majority of consumer products in the United States, they explicitly exempted the firearms industry. And this is something that I'm sure Mike can touch on in greater detail. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that the industry lobbied very aggressively over the years to ensure these immunities for the business because they recognized rightfully that these kinds of lawsuits, both the larger sort of public nuisance lawsuits that might have spurred change in other industries, and these more narrow public product defect lawsuits are both very costly to business. They force change in industries, they force reform in industries, and they weaken some of the political power that the industry exerts. And so these immunities sort of set the gun industry apart from virtually every other industry in America.
Thank you for explaining that. It's complicated, but you've done a lot in the newsroom and in writing, and it's great to have you do that here. I want to go back to Mike for a moment and talk about the NSSF. a little bit more. Mike, last year you published a 7-part series that we did with Rolling Stone, all reported by you and sort of animated by the question, like, what does the gun industry know about its customers? I sort of want to ask you, I mean, you already explained why you thought it was important to look there, but I don't think I've ever asked you this question in this way. Like, how did how did you know that there were secrets there? How did you know that there was stuff that we as the public don't don't know about the industry before you got those documents?
Well, I think after we decided that we wanted to start exploring and figure out, sort of answer this question about what is said behind the scenes versus what is said in public. And I think, part of the impetus for that was just some of the stuff, for example, that we learned about other industries that produce dangerous products like opioids and, all the stuff that had come out through litigation and, what manufacturers knew privately versus what they were telling doctors and so on. Um, so it began in a very like typical boring way, which was just, I had my thought was, well, I could, what manufacturer or company would it make sense to focus on? And it didn't, there was not one that was really any better than the other, but then there was an umbrella under which they all existed, and that was the National Shooting Sports Foundation, where they all paid dues, uh, and that existed specifically to represent the interests of gun makers and vendors, unlike the NRA again, which is primarily focused on representing the interests of gun owners. So it's a really like unique entity in that way. And then the question became like, what is the purpose of a trade group? What does this trade group do? One thing we knew that it did, for example, was it hosted this, hosts this huge event every year called SHOT Show. And that's where like every manufacturer and vendor and anyone adjacent to that industry shows up in Vegas and they all get together, and it's very closed. It's not open to the vast majority of media. Sometimes they let like friendly media in from, websites like guns.com or that sort of thing. Um, so it honestly just began because I was poking around the website, and their website, and seeing just like what their various offerings were, and just from looking around, it showed that they invest in all different kinds of market research that's intended for manufacturers and vendors, to help them make good decisions to make their businesses more profitable. Because the obvious function of the NSSF is to ensure long-term profitability and also sustainability. So like anything that it's doing is toward that end. Um, and that's one of the reasons people or companies, and people pay their dues. So,
Just like any industry's trade group
right,
would
just like
want
any
to
industry,
know what the
right.
landscape is and how they can boost profits. And
In
yeah.
order, and in order to do that, right, you need to know as much about your customers and buying base as possible. You also need to know what different markets might be available to you, all the things, all and that comes along with behavioral research, and also just knowledge of like who's actually buying your weapons. Um, so I was able to we obtained like one or two of the reports, a few years ago, and they showed some really interesting, insights just into like how the industry thinks about gun carrying, for example, and why that's really important. We always think about it in terms of, or the way they always talk about it is in terms of fulfilling a constitutional right, which is also what makes the industry so different from any other, is that it's tied to the Constitution, or that's the way that they frame it. But behind the scenes, there's actually just there's a real business reason for wanting people to carry, for example. And in one of the reports, the early reports that we got, the research indicated that there was a link between likelihood of carrying and then likelihood to keep on buying. And that seemed really interesting to me. Or we'd always thought about it as just like this is a thing that's about self-protection. But really, in many ways, also, it was about cultivating a behavior that would ultimately increase profitability. And then the question became, what's the tension there? Okay, so we see like, you know, whatever whatever the industry or the NRA says or the NSSF says about why it's essential to have an armed society, as you were saying earlier, at the end of the day, it's all meaningless if there's no business and everyone's goal in business is to make money. So then the idea was let's get as many of these. Once we discovered these reports existed, let's see how many of them we can get and how many decisions, how they're thinking about profitability and how they're thinking about Americans and how they function in service of making money for the industry.
So I want to ask you, of those 7 stories, which we published under sort of the title of The Secrets of the Gun Industry, what are the main things that you would like the public to know about how that industry operates or thinks? I mean, you mentioned the connection between carrying and purchasing more. Is there anything else that you would just say, like, people who are interested in gun violence in America should know this and
Yeah,
don't
well, let's pick one,
necessarily?
to keep it succinct, I'll pick one thing and it'll be directly related to what I just said.
Mhm.
One of the reports that we got in which I think had the most astounding finding of all of the find there were so many findings, so many things that we discovered through going through these reports. But one of the things that the NSSF discovered through like this massive survey that it conducted a few years ago uh, was that the act of people carrying and the more normalized that the act of carrying has become, the more fearful people have become, and not just people who don't have guns, but gun owners themselves aren't. The research showed were not comfortable with this idea.
Feel less safe when there are
That's
more
what
and
the
more people
research
carrying
said.
guns. Yeah.
Yes, as more people carry, more people, including gun owners themselves, feel less safe.
Mhm.
So everything that we've been that seemed to fly in the face of everything that we've been told by the gun industry and the NRA, which is that carrying a gun provides a sense of security, a
Mhm.
sense of feeling like you're protected in the extremely unlikely event that you could find yourself in a situation where you would need to use a firearm for self-defense. This seemed to suggest that was not only incorrect, but that also it was having the opposite effect, which was that it was making society feel more tense, more fearful. And the question that is unanswered is what is the result of that? And one thing that it could mean is that people, because they feel more fearful as more people carry guns, are then compelled to buy more guns. And then it
Right.
becomes this feedback loop, which is, you know, uh,
A
dangerous.
real possibility. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So I just want to remind everyone who's here that we do have a chat function, and if you want to put in a question, we would love to hear from you if you have specific questions to ask of our panelists. And we will come back to those questions later. Ava, I would love to talk about your recent story for The Trace about I mean, ICE is all over the news. Everyone's talking about immigration enforcement, federal agents in cities, all of that. You uncovered um, that weapons manufacturers last year made the highest amount that they've made in at least 10 years, and basically 3 times what they made in almost nearly 3 times what they made in 2015. Um, from from DHS contracts, from the Department of Homeland Security contracts. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got there, how you found this out?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've known for a while that the recently, from I believe 2024 on, gun sales in the civilian market have been declining. So, I mean, as we've talked about, the gun industry is very aware of its own future, and it's very conscious of trying to keep profits up. So I was curious about how they were dealing with this. A lot of publicly traded companies will publish transcripts of their quarterly calls with investors online that anyone can take a look at. Unfortunately, one of the things that makes this a little tricky is that not a lot of the biggest gun makers are publicly traded. One that makes ammo. It's called Olin Winchester. Their parent corporation is called Olin Corp. I was going through their investor calls last year, and I saw that they had expectedly sort of lamented this decline in civilian sales, but they kept reassuring investors that federal contracts would sort of help make up the difference. I was curious then to see if it was all defense contracts or Homeland Security. And lo and behold, it was in large part Homeland Security, in addition to Pentagon contracts. The Trump administration has decimated a lot of the public facing data for like CDC, for example. One thing that has not been touched is the federal procurement database, which shows us when DHS is looking to give a contract for a gun maker or an ammo maker or whatever. You can, in pretty precise detail, see how those transactions unfold and how they've changed from previous years. So once we took a look at that data, it was pretty clear that there was a huge jump in 2025.
That it's not like the number itself was unknown, but it's not exactly a surprising finding, right? We know that there's just a ton of money being funneled towards this, and probably it's only the beginning, right? Given budget allocations, though obviously that's a little tied up at the moment. But what surprised you most in your reporting? Like, you probably were not surprised to see that there was this big jump. What did surprise you?
Yeah, there was a couple of things. Again, it's the fact that there was a jump was not surprising. I think the extent to which the jump happened was pretty shocking. It depends on how you sort of assess the budget of different agencies, but by one metric, the combined budget of ICE is greater than the entire DOJ's budget. We sort of outlined the more details about that number in the story, but it's just an incredible amount of money that is being given to Trump's immigration, his campaign to deport a record amount of immigrants. The other thing that was, I think, surprising is we have a quote from Tom Homan, who is Trump's border czar in the story. And he's talking to this, it's like an industry conference that happens in Phoenix every year called the Border Security Expo. And I was listening to his speech, and he pretty plainly states, I think you're going to get, speaking to DHS, prospective DHS contractors, I think you're going to get more money than you ever had. And he was right. At that same conference, Kristi Noem gives a speech. We didn't quote her, but she reiterates more or less the same point. She's saying we cannot do our goal of mass deportations without private industries' investment and help. So just broadly, Trump 2.0 seems a lot more upfront about their connections to private industry, including but not limited to the gun industry. The fact that they are saying that quiet part out loud more so this time around than in the first Trump administration, I was a little bit surprised by.
Yeah, that quote in that story really jumped out at me too. I know you're gonna stay on that specific part of the beat, and will keep us informed about that as it goes on. I would love to hear from Champ for a little bit, and specifically, we've talked about what the industry does to drive profits, and particularly what Mike was able to glean from NSSF documents and sort of looking at the NSSF deeply. But Champ has kind of come at this from a different angle over the past several years, reporting a lot on the industry, but also really looking very specifically at Sig Sauer quite a bit. And we published a big feature story with Business Week that really sort of takes the reader inside gun manufacturing in a new and unprecedented way. Champ, I want you to tell everyone who may not be familiar with your previous work on Sig Sauer what led you in this direction.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first thing was sort of regular, kind of in the same way Ava described, just regular reporter diligence that sort of leads you to this unusual finding. So I was combing through court records as I do, related to gun companies, and especially because of what I outlined earlier, that there is all this immunity It can be really telling when lawsuits do penetrate and which lawsuits penetrate and which proliferate. Um, and so there was all these lawsuits against Sig Sauer many years ago. I started looking into them and reading through the complaint filings, and it occurred to me that there had been this big scandal years before with this weapon that Sig Sauer produces called the P320, where it had been alleged that the gun could fire when dropped, and people had demonstrated this on video. The company had announced this voluntary upgrade program to make a change, and that had all happened in like 2017. So it's now like 2019, 2020, and I'm looking through court records and I'm seeing a lot of lawsuits against SIG that are alleging that same gun is responsible for these unintentional shootings, and that people are claiming the gun has a defect, but they're not claiming that the gun is firing when dropped. And so I was trying to understand, well, why is it that this gun is still being alleged to have a problem after this voluntary upgrade program? And so that kind of led in two
Wait,
different
let me just
directions.
interrupt you for
Yeah,
one
please.
second. If
Yeah.
if they're not alleging that it fired when dropped, when or what are they alleging the defect is at that point?
Yeah, so I mean the most basic level is that people have alleged that the gun has fired when they didn't pull the trigger. And that happens in a variety of circumstances according to these victims. These alleged victims, they say that the gun fired when it was holstered, when it was unholstered, when it was on their hip and they twisted or moved. Sometimes it was in a bag and the bag got rustled around and then those shootings. And so, sort of pick up where I left off, those complaints led me in two different directions. The one hand, I wanted to get a sort of comprehensive accounting of those shootings. How common were they? What sort of investigations had been conducted? Because there is no regulatory body to look into this stuff, the only way that you get any sort of investigative lens on into what happens in these shootings is when police investigate. A lot of police officers who use the P320, a lot of police officers were injured by their P320s. And so law enforcement agencies had conducted investigations looking into the gun and made determinations about whether or not they thought it was safe for their officers to use. So I wanted to get a complete accounting of all of that work that police officers had done, that independent firearm experts had done, that had, court testimony had revealed, and so on and so forth. And so we did a story a few years ago with the Washington Post that sort of outlined all of that detail. It had videos of some of these shootings, it had interviews with victims, it had interviews with police departments where these shootings had become so common that the agencies got rid of the gun. And it outlined that broader regulatory absence that I was discussing earlier. But the other direction that led was an attempt to elucidate what precisely is the problem, if there is one, with the P320. Firearm defects are notoriously difficult to replicate. There's been a number of alleged defects over the years that have, some of which have eventually been replicated, but many of them go, years and years and years in these civil lawsuits without ever having a plaintiff's expert, reliably reproduce the defect over and over again. And that is for a variety of reasons, but the firing mechanisms in these guns depend on very, minute changes and shifts in parts within the weapons, and so it can be challenging to reproduce these shootings. And so in the Sig Sauer P320 case, plaintiffs experts had not early on been able to replicate the shootings that these victims had alleged to have occurred, but they had occurred in such large quantities, and experts that I spoke with
And
said
sometimes on videotape, right?
and sometimes on videotape, yeah, and experts that I'd spoken with had suggested that this was not the frequency of these issues and the sort of commonality between the problems was suggestive of some sort of design problem as opposed to some sort of human behavior issue. And so I wanted to talk to people who made the guns because it seemed to me that they would have they would have some perspective on whether the gun they had produced had any sort of vulnerability. And so I started making calls to former employees at SIG who had worked at the company. And that led me to this Business Week story, which ultimately takes a look at a decade of growth at SIG, which is one of the fastest growing firearms manufacturers in the world. And many of those former employees had alleged to me that huge explosion in growth had been attended by a sort of corner cutting in quality control at the company. And they offered to me that the way that the company managed quality may explain why the P320 has the issues that the victims allege that it has. And that had sort of been the next plank in this reporting, which was published very recently.
So, basically, when you talk to these insiders, they said this may actually be about manufacturing processes and not about design, but actually about how these little parts are being made.
Yeah.
Can you, one of my favorite parts of the story is the detail involving the Secret Service, and which I feel like explains this a little bit. Can you recount that anecdote here?
Yeah. So basically, a former sales executive at SIG, had explained to me this story that had occurred I think it was like the late 2010s, or early 2010s, I should say, where the Secret Service had a contract with SIG, and was using one of its pistols, not the P320. It was a gun called the P226, if I'm not mistaken, or P229, but another pistol manufactured by SIG. And at the time, SIG was in the process of trying to reduce the costs required to manufacture that gun. This is something that all manufacturers do. Once products go into the marketplace, they can be expensive to manufacture, and in order to get a better margin on the product, they'll change their manufacturing processes, cheapen those manufacturing processes, which does not always necessitate any sort of drop off in quality. Well, SIG had decided that rather than depend upon its former parent company in Germany, which does a lot of precision manufacturing, and costly precision manufacturing for some of these internal components. They were going to try to use a sort of faster and cheaper machining process known as metal injection molding. And metal injection molding is essentially inject they have molds, and they inject like a fluid and powder metal mixture that eventually then is like put into an oven, and it hardens, and we get these parts. Now, again, that process is not necessarily going to reduce the quality of the guns, but it's difficult to calibrate and to sort of dial in. And in the instance that you're describing, the Secret Service had essentially noticed that the parts that were in their guns, some of them were manufactured in Germany using Germany's manufacturing methods. Some were manufactured in India by this metal injection molding supplier. And they expected to have been notified about that. And this executive told me that he hadn't even been aware that SIG was switching its processes, which kind of goes to demonstrate the speed with which these changes were being implemented, and sort of how it had frustrated some of SIG's most prominent customers.
Mhm. So you have over the past few years, this story, an initial SIG story with the Washington Post, but a lot of other stories on the gun industry. Many of them have focused on kind of technical issues or technical questions. And I'm just curious if you can say a little bit about how gun owners and Second Amendment advocates have reacted to the work. Like what has because in many cases they're the ones who are most directly affected, right,
Sure.
by safety issues with firearms. I'm just curious, what you've heard as you make calls, what kind of emails you've gotten, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, primarily, what's been nice about this reporting is it sort of cuts across what is normally a political divide when you report on guns and gun violence in the US. I'm not focused in these stories on the traditional gun violence that makes front page news. As you just noted, it's about gun violence that gun owners experience when they don't expect to experience it. And it's about their safety. So I've had a really good response from people in the gun owning communities and in the Second Amendment advocacy communities, who share some of my sources' concern about whether or not the products that they're buying are safe to use. There is also a sort of similar dimension to the one that you have in the sort of political gridlock and infighting, which is that there's like brand loyalty with these businesses. And so when you report on a company that many people love, then they are really critical of that reporting. And other people who hate that company are very supportive of that reporting. So you'll see, I see it all the time when these stories get published. There's a lot of back and forth on, Reddit forums and stuff where, some people think that the reporting is airtight and they love it. Other people, find every little sort of thing to nitpick in it. But by and large, what I've noticed and what's been the takeaway that has meant the most to me and seemed the most illustrative of the need to do this reporting is that a lot of the people I call, even when I'm doing the reporting, and who work at the companies who write about guns regularly or who work on guns regularly, who are firearms instructors, all these things, a lot of them are not aware of the regulatory absence in terms of consumer product safety with the firearms industry. And so they think that they are protected when I reach out to them by some sort of federal agency that has the authority to issue a product recall. And they're surprised to know that in fact that is not the case, and it sort of is up to these civil court battles to uncover whether or not a given firearm has an issue. And I think that that realization to me sort of crystallizes the problem, which is not necessarily to say that all these people that I'm talking about are in favor of adding some sort of regulatory oversight. Some
Hmm.
of them see some sort of risk to the Second Amendment for that, which I respect. But the reality is that a lot of them just don't know. And you see this there was, SIG had campaigned or had lobbied effectively in New Hampshire to get an immunity bill passed that would protect them from some of these more recent lawsuits. And you can see it in the arguments that the legislators who are pushing that bill forward make in the legislature, where they sort of make these pronouncements that if a gun is quote unquote found to be defective, then their immunity bill would not apply. And I don't know. I haven't. These people did not respond to my attempts to question about this, so I don't know if that was some sort of cynical play to make it seem like there wasn't a risk to this immunity bill being passed, or if they just didn't know that there actually isn't any agency to sort of make a finding about whether or not the gun is
Hmm.
defective. But again, I think it's illustrative of the point that there is this assumption that when a product is defective, there is some determination that will be made that it is in fact defective that everyone can then rely upon. And in the gun
Hmm.
industry, that does not exist. So it's just up to people to claim that the gun is defective and then to argue about it against very powerful, very financially well-resourced, and very legally well-resourced companies in court, which sometimes takes, 10, 15, 20 years to finally expose, when there is in fact a problem.
Yeah. Um, I want to ask Ava and Mike if they've had any notable reactions to their stories on the gun industry over the past year or so. If there's anything that sort of crossed political divides or surprised them in how people reacted.
Uh, well, in my case, I mean, it depend. I mean, within the larger gun culture, I would say there was a real backlash to my reporting, which was, you know, fairly predictable, and that came via the NSSF on its own website, but then also its affiliated media outlets like Bearing Arms and The Truth About Guns. It almost at times seemed coordinated. Um, and by that it was sort of this desire to undermine what we had put out. And it is worth emphasizing here that everything we reported last year was entirely based on primary NSSF documents, video, raw video, and on the record quotes. There was nothing that did not come from one of those sources. So they couldn't actually challenge anything that I put into the world. Um, but I think that they wanted to reframe it to as best they could, and wanted to sort of undermine my credibility as best they could. I will say, um, part of the reason that I was able to get the research, some of it is available through the NSSF's website, but it's at an exorbitant cost and can be like $1,000 for a report, and it's deliberately prohibitive in that way. But it's at a vastly reduced or even zero cost to NSSF members, of which there are many thousands. Um, and there are definitely a portion of members, because it encompasses a lot of different people in addition to just manufacturers and sellers, who were unhappy with the direction the organization was moving in, and had decided that for a long time had considered it to be a sort of apolitical entity that wasn't really interested in culture wars, unlike the NRA, in that from their perspective, the NSSF had been steadily moving in that direction in the age of Trump, in an effort to sell more firearms to people who were carrying them because of, culture war issues, paranoia,
Mhm.
hatred of the government, like that sort of thing. And there was some concern there. And to them, it felt necessary for that organization to receive some scrutiny, because it had never received it before. So anyway, um, so which is to say that while the reaction from representatives of the gun industry was predictable, there are plenty of people in that world who are definitely very supportive of the reporting and wanted it to come out
Mhm.
because they felt like a sense of concern. And I think, especially, at this point, I don't know how many reports we obtained, but most especially, like as an example, the one about what the industry knows about carrying concealed handguns and how that actually makes gun owners feel was sort of like a prime example for them about why they felt like it was important to push some of that stuff into the world and to, put some sunlight.
Yeah, I mean, because you bring up culture wars, I sort of want to ask you to say a little bit about the first story in your series about extremism and specifically, about um, one guy who planned an attack in California and is now in prison, Ian Rogers, and what you were able to learn about sort of the gun industry and extremism. Can you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah. And the reason we settled on that story was entirely, it was driven, the decision to do a story about extremism was driven by, the first batch of research that we obtained. And one of the most important findings was that, for the last 5 years, 6 years since COVID, the industry has peddled this claim that its consumer base is heavily diversifying and that the drivers of profits were not, in fact, the traditional base, meaning like white men from rural and suburban areas, middle age or older, but a much younger crowd or, people of color, black, brown, women, all these groups that were not traditionally part of the market were apparently, pushing gun ownership to new heights. And a lot of different media outlets ran with that story entirely based on just what the NSSF in particular was putting out on its website and telling people. But the research, but that was based in, and that, for example, would be based on research that it had internally generated, but it didn't make that research readily available to the public. And then when we got our hands on that research, one of the key findings, and again, it's not that its research is comprehensive or that it's relies on necessarily a representative sample set, but it's the best thing that it offers to its members, and it's its best insights into its own customer base, and that's why it does it.
Mhm.
What it discovered was that the vast majority of people who are buying firearms were still white men, and that the most of the people who
Well,
sell them,
there what had been this increase in other consumers, and then it really fell
well,
off very
it
quickly,
was, I
right?
mean, increase, like in quotes, it was a
Yeah,
marginal
a small one.
increase. It
Yes.
was still, even at its peak, when there were theoretically more people buying firearms that didn't fit that portrait, it was still fairly minimal. The majority was still white males. And then after that sort of atypical COVID year, the research showed that it just reverted back to the way it had been before, which was that the vast majority
Yeah.
of people who were buying were white men. The vast majority of people who were selling, white men. They were sort of like mirror images of each other. The next leading, group of gun sellers was white women. So in total, like very white industry based on their own research. And that, I mean, and again, and just to put a bow on this, it also was clear that most of the revenue the industry was generating was coming from repeat buyers, which is it was heavily relying on people who had already gotten through the door and were continuing to buy, as opposed to people who were just like walking through the door the first time, because it's actually kind of hard for them to get people through the door the first time. So you have white men who are ultimately the leading demographic who are purchasing firearms, and then that group you have particularly and necessarily engaged in the act of repeatedly buying firearms. So the question is, what does that mean? And we also know sort of generally what profile, I don't want to say the typical gun owner, but the gun owner who likes to stockpile weapons. We have a sense of what that political profile looks like, and it's not traditionally like a hyper liberal,
Diverse one.
progressive
Yeah.
person who's living, in New York. And that led us to like what's the effect of what it seemed like was, oh, this actually feels like maybe there's like a almost like a hidden paramilitary lying in wait, this group of similar people who, because the industry needed it to, was continuing to purchase, and we're all part of the sort of same cohort and demographic. And like, what could that look like? And that led us to this man, Ian Rogers, who got arrested shortly after the January 6th insurrection because he and his best friend had been planning to carry out an attack on the Democratic headquarters in Sacramento, along with some other Democratic targets. And their entire reasoning was that, you know, the which is, sort of parroting the larger talking points from the NRA and the industry historically, that Democrats are engaged in, they're always teetering on the edge of martial law and confiscating firearms and imposing some kind of like communist regime that's going to suppress, whatever you take American freedom to be, and so on and so forth. And one of the ways that Ian Rogers, the main character of that story, dealt with that was by having, I forgot the exact number, but 60, 70, he had a huge number of cache of firearms, uh, huge amount of ammo stored away.
Mike, I'm gonna interrupt you and tell everyone here you really should read the story because this character corresponded with this source corresponded with Mike extensively, and you can really understand kind of his thinking. But I want to move to some questions, online questions, because we only have a few more minutes here. Thank you, Mike. Champ, are you aware, this comes from someone else, not from me. Are you aware of any previous firearm defect issues that actually led to significant litigation or change? Is someone's question. They mention Remington, but point out that Remington went bankrupt before there was any resolution.
Yeah, I would say litigation and change, very different things. Lots of litigation, little change. Remington is the prime example. They had a rifle that was alleged to be defective, and I can't remember the exact details, but it was something like 60 years of litigation against the company. Many people had
Sorry, I
died.
should just emphasize they said successful litigation. So,
Yeah, yeah,
litigation where they
yeah,
get somewhere.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it depends on how you define success. If you define success as winning the lawsuits, I'd have to go through. I have a huge database of these lawsuits that I have to go through and see. But I'm fairly certain that some were won against Remington and some were won against the gunmaker Taurus in the past. Some were won against the gunmaker Ruger in the past. But wins for victims sometimes look like really landmark settlements that
Mhm.
result in a lot of money being passed over, or in an agreement, with the court to issue some sort of recall or to stop selling a gun or something. And so, yes, other manufacturers have experienced this, and it sort of gets to the point that I made earlier that this is, while I've done a lot of reporting, extensive reporting on Sig Sauer. This is about a regulatory absence in an industry.
Right.
So none of these companies have to comply with sort of minimum safety standards in their designs or in their manufacturing processes. And so you've had companies like Ruger had this old model revolver that was alleged to drop fire. Taurus has had several pistol models that were alleged to drop fire, some of which it stopped selling after a big settlement. Remington has had several rifles that people have alleged fired under different conditions. The gunmaker Savage Arms has had some. So yes, there's a lot of other examples about this in the court records.
Thanks, Champ. I have another question for Mike about the NSSF. Someone from the audience asks if the NSSF survey about carrying indicated that there was any way to sort of break the cycle where increased carrying was leading to more gun purchasing.
It did not express any interest in knowing that. It just noted it as like a key finding. It was one of that key finding, and there was also a sounding of the alarm about how millennials were reacting to gun ownership. They were very worried that they had effectively lost that entire generation, and that was like a big thing that was in the report. Um, but no, other than just noting that this was the reality that they had found
I mean,
after.
as I recall, the question was asked as, do you feel safer when you're carrying, right? Or like, do you feel safer when there is the legal ability to carry in your state, right?
I don't re I actually I would perhaps misspeak if I tried to say exactly what
Okay.
was off the top of my head, but
But
the takeaway was that a majority of that it has not led gun owners to feel more safe, and that it has led many of them to feel less safe as
yeah.
with more people carrying. And the ramifications of that also went unexplored. So it's not, but they know it's not as if, and it didn't, and obviously it didn't, has not in any way changed industry behavior. It continues to promote carrying, perhaps because it's the most essential component of its business model. I mean,
Hmm.
without carrying,
Hmm.
there's not really a modern gun industry, which is more than ever built around the concept of self-defense and not hunting.
Right. Um, so I have another question from the audience, and it involves numbers and data. So I'm going to start with Ava, but you can ask others to chime in if you'd like. And this is something, it's addressing like a concept that comes up sometimes when people are looking at the gun industry. I think like think tanks and journalists and policy analysts. The audience member asked, can someone address the concept that the gun industry internalizes revenues and externalizes costs, meaning that the societal costs of gun violence are borne by others, and sort of how those things balance out. This person says, and I don't know if this is accurate, but it looks reasonable. Last estimates I've seen are that the industry's economic footprint was $75 billion, while the overall costs of medical treatment, policing, prosecution, incarceration, et cetera, is more like $250 billion a year. So is that something that you're familiar with, Ava? I know it's something Champ has looked at a little bit, if not.
Yeah, Champ can probably speak to this better than I can, but it's a really
Yeah.
interesting point. Um, the the as Champ sort of touched on earlier, the thing that the gun industry has done in order to enable that is sort of put forth this idea that whatever people do with their wares, which is something that can kill people, whatever happens after the sale occurs is not their responsibility. It's separate from their purview, right? And
Mhm.
that is sort of the tension that I think the question is alluding to, is all of the costs associated with everything that happens after a gun sale. The industry has both culturally and legally communicated this idea that that is none of their business, that is not uh, something that they have to concern themselves with.
Mhm.
Yeah, if I could sort of beat a dead horse on that one really quickly, uh, the what you're outlining there is that is the exact problem that had spurred change in virtually every other industry that was associated with a massive public health crisis. The opioid industry, the automotive industry with seatbelts, tobacco industry with cancer. All of these industries had that exact problem. They were making a lot of money on the one hand, but all of the cost was being externalized. So there was a vastly higher cost associated with cities dealing with the public health consequences of that product being in the marketplace in that way. And that is exactly what the industry had recognized in the late 90s and lobbied very effectively to protect themselves from any sort of litigation that might expose the sort of or quantify the difference there. So to answer the question specifically, we actually don't know precisely what the
Right.
difference in cost is there because we haven't had the sort of accounting we might get out of city lawsuits alleging that they have spent X amount on these things that are caused by gun violence and while the industry has profited another amount, right?
Thanks, Champ.
Yes, thank you, Champ. Tally, Ava, Mike, that was I think, really insightful conversation, and a great note to end on just there. Just a couple of final things before we wrap up. Um, we will send out a recording of this session after the fact, so be on the lookout for that. And I also wanted to offer 3 ways, as it says there on the screen, to stay connected. One is, if you haven't already subscribed to our newsletters, you can do that through the QR code or at thetrace.org. That's a great way to be informed and see our latest reporting on the gun industry as soon as it drops. Also, check out our reporting on solutions to community violence, suicide, and all the rest. You can also follow us on social. LinkedIn is a particularly good place actually to get informed of the events, but we're on Blue Sky, Instagram as well. And finally, if this conversation had value for you, if our work has value for you, please consider being a member. Our work is reader powered. If you are willing to join the more than 1,000 readers who have stepped up to support our work financially, we'd be most grateful. Again, thanks so much for being here, and look for updates on our next event in your inbox. Thank you. Bye.